Prepare for A Rood Awakening.
Shalom. This is Michael Rood at Ophel Gardens in Jerusalem. I am standing in front of the rubble of the Jerusalem temple that was destroyed by the Titus and Roman legions in the year 70 of the Common Era. The Temple Mount was cleared of every last vestige of the temple of the Lord, and with the destruction of the buildings, all of the rehearsals that were part of the feast of the Lord ceased. The prophetic shadow pictures of good things to come that were part of the daily life of the priesthood were brought to an abrupt halt when the Levite sons of Zadok were slaughtered and ejected from this mountaintop. Since that fateful day, traditions were developed by the Jewish people that replaced the intricate rehearsals that were once an integral part of the feast of the Lord. The rehearsals that were set in place through divine revelation to Moses and King David were replaced by traditions that could be practiced in the homes and synagogues of the Jewish people. These traditions help us to remember the rehearsals that were once a part of the Holy Temple service. Without these traditions, the rehearsals detailed in the Feast of the Lord would have been lost to antiquity. Without these living oracles of God that were committed to the Jews, and the traditions that called them to remembrance, so much of the New Testament would be incomprehensible to the Western Christian church. Without an understanding of the temple service that was part of the life of Paul the Apostle, so much of what he writes would fall on deaf ears. Ears that have no context to understand the things which have been all but extinct for the past 2,000 years. Without an understanding of the feast of the Lord, the foundation of Bible prophecy would remain buried under the rubble of the temple. Join us in the Lester Summerall television studios where this multimedia presentation on the prophecies in the Feast of the Lord was recorded before the Bible prophecy students assembled by the Prophecy Club. This is Bible Prophecy 101. Now, Episode 2 in the 26-part series on the prophecies in the Feast of the Lord, A Thief in the Night. John Yochanan was a first-century Jewish follower of the Jewish Messiah. And it is in his gospel, in his record, that he says, I have not written everything that could be written or should be written. The world wouldn't even be able to contain the scrolls of the things that should be written about Jesus of Nazareth. But he said, but this I have written, that you might know that Yahshua of Nazareth is the Messiah, the only begotten Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name. Now, how does a Jewish disciple of the Messiah prove in his culture to his people that Yahshua is the Messiah? How does he do it? Of all the things that could and should be written, the world wouldn't be able to contain the scrolls. What is it that he selects, that he uses, that proves that he is Messiah? John shows how Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled the spring feast of the Lord just as they had been rehearsed every year, year after year, century after century, for over 1,000 years. And that each one of these feasts were a prophetic shadow picture that we were required, Israel was required to go up to Jerusalem to these feasts, to these rehearsals, and every one of these feasts were embedded with an expectation that this could be the time that the Messiah is revealed. And so every time we came to the feast, it was with that expectation, this may be the year. We would come up, we would purify ourselves, we would mikvah or baptize ourselves before the festivities began, expecting that maybe this is the year that the Messiah comes. And we see that the Gospel of John details how Yahshua of Nazareth fulfills every detail of the spring feast just as they've been rehearsed for thousands of years. The Gospel of John really can't be understood from a Western or a Gentile perspective that's completely removed from the feast of the Lord. Because unless you understand the feast and understand what was going on, then as we read, we really don't see the fulfillment of all the pictures. And so today we are going to go into these things and there will be an explosion in your mind. There will be a perspective that you will be changed forever. You will walk out of here as different people, thinking differently, and there's nothing that you'll be able to do about it. Because when the rivers begin to flow together in your mind into streams that will change your life forever, you will walk out and will have a different understanding of the scriptures and how they apply to life. Now we see that the same writer, John, near the end of his life, then when he wrote the book of Revelation, which I call the Gospel of Revelation. Gospel means good news. And those who look forward to the coming of the Messiah to rule and reign as the conquering king, as the son of David, that is good news to those who love his coming. And we see in the book of Revelation that the same writer, John, then details how the fall feast of the Lord are fulfilled to the very day, the very hour, the exact moment, just as they've been rehearsed for thousands and thousands of years. Also, we see that in the Gospels, we see Yeshua, the Messiah, as he teaches and he interprets the fall feast. Because what happened is 40 years after the death, burial, and resurrection and ascension of the Messiah, that's when the temple was destroyed. The priesthood, in effect, ceased at that moment, and all the rehearsals no longer took place. And so what has happened among the Jews as they have gone all around the earth and dispersed over 3 different continents, then what happened is that there were remembrances put in place to remember the way that things used to be, the way that these rehearsals used to take place. And so these things still exist, and we see how the Messiah interpreted the fall feast, and then in the book of Revelation we see how the fall feast will be fulfilled. And again, the book of Revelation cannot be understood if we are completely stripped from our heritage of the feast of the Lord and all we have known are pagan feasts and festivals. So what we are going to do is divorce ourselves from pagan sun god worship, all the feasts and festivals associated with it, and we are going to go to the feast of the Lord and see what the first century Jewish followers of the Messiah saw and understood. And this is what one of the things that's so exciting for me is that as I'm going around teaching, for the most part, those to whom I am speaking are Gentile followers of the Jewish Messiah. This is really, who could have expected this? See, nearly 2,000 years ago on the day of Pentecost, on the high day of Shavuot, when the Holy Spirit was poured out, in which most Christians look at that as the beginning of the church, from that day until the household of Cornelius, which were the first Gentiles that were brought into the faith, for those first 15 years, there were no Gentile followers of the Jewish Messiah at all. None, not one. There were tens and perhaps hundreds of thousands of Jews who believed, and they gave their lives to get out and get the good news of the Messiah out to the Gentiles. That's how the Gentiles got to hear to begin with. And it was good news for the Gentiles. And now, after all this time, here we are, one big happy family. Followers of the Messiah, sons of the covenant, and it is an exciting time for us. Now, of course, there are things that we will disagree on. As happens in any good family, there are going to be disagreements. And as I often say, that if you and I can't find something to disagree on within the first 3 minutes of meeting each other, neither one of us are very intelligent. But that's not our goal here. The goal is to be a provision for each other and for these things to be understandable. And as it's often said, if you have 2 Jews in the room, you're going to have at least 3 opinions. And there are some things in God's Word that are just not clear enough to where there can be a consensus on it. There's always something of which you can differ in opinions on. But yet, we know that at the end of every argument, what we say is when the Messiah comes, he will interpret these things. When the Messiah comes, he'll interpret the Torah. He'll interpret the Word, and we will understand it then. And so in the Gospels, we see that in actuality. We see where the Messiah has interpreted the rehearsals, he has interpreted the Torah so that the doctrines and commandments, the religious rules and regulations of men, that are heaped upon people in order to manipulate and control and to coerce them to do what religious leaders want them to do. The Messiah came, he busted them down, he stripped the authority from the doctrines and commandments of men and exposed the heart of the Torah. And that is part of what we are going to be able to see as we take a look at this spring feast of the Lord. In order to do that, though, I would like to go to 1 Thessalonians and the 5th chapter. We read what the Rabbi Shaul, which you commonly know him as the Apostle Paul, but of course Paul was a Hebrew rabbi, a Jewish rabbi. He was a teacher of the Torah, and throughout his letters he is constantly quoting the Torah. And we see here that he says, "But of the times and seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you." Now, why was it not necessary for Shaul to write unto these believers in Thessalonica concerning the times and seasons? First of all, they all kept God's reckoning of time. It was their culture. It was the way they lived from the moment that they were born. It was God's reckoning of time in which the days began at sundown, the months began with the first sliver of the new moon. God's reckoning of time was the way that these people lived. And the word seasons here is, throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, the word seasons is the word Moedim. Moedim and the word Moedim are the appointed times or the feast of the Lord, the prophetic shadow pictures of things to come. So these people in this culture at this time, they could not even imagine that 2,000 years later, the entire world would be living under a reckoning of time that's completely divorced from God's reckoning, and that the whole world would have completely forsaken God's reckoning. It couldn't have been imagined then. Nor would they have imagined that at one time in the future that those who say they're followers of the Messiah would have inherited renamed pagan celebrations, which for the most part described their seasons and how they lived their lives. And they would have forsaken the feast of the Lord, which are the prophetic shadow pictures that they all knew and lived in their lives back at that time. And then he goes on to say, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord, or the millennium of the Lord, so comes as a thief in the night."